The Costa Concordia, the biggest salvage ever. On September the 16th, 2013, 100,000 tons of steel, water and debris were pulled upright in an operation called parbuckling. It was the make or break moment in the career of senior Salvage Master Nick Sloan. The day when any one of thousands of unknown factors could have spelled failure and the end of a brilliant career.
Okay, we're going up 10%.
By dawn the next day, the ship lay upright, ready to be refloated and towed away. Costa Concordia capsized on the night of the 13th of January 2012, tragically killing 32 passengers. One man, South African Salvage Master Nick Sloan, led the massive engineering project to turn her upright again and lift her off the rocks.
We had 33,000 tons of steel, 20,000 tons of cement, over 15,000 individual dives.
For the first time ever, the story of the senior Salvage Master's coordination of this unique operation can be told. From the day he set foot on the beautiful Mediterranean island of Giglio.
I came from New Zealand straight to Italy, and we went over the plan in Ravenna. But when you actually come and see it, and on the sort of the island of Giglio, and you look at the island and you look at the rock, and then the ship, I think it's a lot more difficult than the photograph. And then when you actually stand on board, you get the sense of actually how big it is.
800 men and women worked under Nick Sloan's direct command, and thousands of others labored in shipyards across Italy to design and build the structures needed to make the parbuckling work. On the night of the 13th of January 2012, Concordia's captain, Francesco Schettino, ordered an unauthorized close sail-by of the Tuscan island of Giglio, a maneuver designed to entertain islanders and passengers alike. The ship struck a rock that ripped open her hull. She lost power completely and began drifting dangerously out to the open sea, but mercifully, the wind pushed her back to the shore. Although 4,000 passengers were rescued, 32 people drowned in the chaos that ensued. The day after the disaster, Captain Schettino was arrested as the dramatic search for survivors continued. All but 2 of the bodies were recovered. Miraculously, a couple of Korean honeymooners were rescued 2 days later. They had survived on biscuits and bottled water as the ship sank. Very soon, islanders realized that the cruise liner wreck itself demanded immediate attention. Concordia was full of food, chemicals, and heavy oil. A leak would have been an ecological disaster and ruined the island's tourist economy.
There was the threat of a potential environmental disaster. If the ship had been ripped open, the fuel would have leaked out of the tanks, and this would have polluted the whole coast, including the coast of Tuscany.
The Dutch company Smith Salvage won the bid to carry out the oil removal, called debunkering.
It was Friday night, the 13th of January, when it happened. And we immediately mobilized a team. We had here 4 trucks loaded, and they went down to Italy. And when I arrived on the scene, in my position as operations manager, to to assist in the first stage of the operation. Then the equipment came on board a crane barge from our partner Neri, arriving on scene.
Working with local partner Neri Salvage, the delicate process of removing all the ship's fuel began, as islanders watched anxiously.
The danger was that of the ship collapsing or moving with our divers working inside the hull. And this would have been fatal for them.
2 months later, the job was done. The local population gathered on the quayside to show their appreciation as the debunkering crew sailed away. The 350-meter-long ship rested on 2 rocky ridges that led to a 70-meter underwater cliff. Concordia not only threatened to sink, but also to break in two as she bent between the rocky outcrops. All the weight of the steel and furnishing of the cruise ship was concentrated on the weakest part of the structure. The ship represented a mortal threat to the livelihood of the islanders. The sea around Giglio is a nature reserve. A unique species of giant clam lives at the bottom of the reef Concordia rested on. Engineer Giovanni Ceccarelli is a naval architect, and he came up with an idea that he was convinced would save the island. He put his plan to local firm Micoperi, and they made a bid for the salvage.
The idea was always to protect the environment, and in order to do this we always believed that the ship had to be removed whole.
In April 2012, Costa Cruises awarded a $450 million salvage contract to the Italian firm Micoperi and US giant Titan Salvage to remove the wreck. Giovanni Ceccarelli's plan seemed simple enough, but would prove to be a massive engineering challenge and require the most advanced computer analysis and design. The consortium called in senior Salvage Master Nick Sloan to manage the project.
Every job, you have a portion of luck that you need, and you take your luck when you can get it. So it's important that you plan and prepare, but you need that bit of luck.
Sloan, the fearless South African master of ship salvage, is famed for dangerous work all over the world. An unassuming mariner, he is known for his dry sense of humor and ability to thrive under pressure. He was called to the Concordia site from another nautical disaster on the other side of the world.
When you're going onto a burning ship, you've got no idea what the cargo is. These big container ships carrying thousands of different types of products, and sometimes they react with heat or water, so you've got no idea what the manifest is. So those are, there's always a sense of risk. I think it suits the people that have a bit of adrenaline junkie factor behind them.
Despite his easygoing manner, Nick Sloan has no less than 30 years' experience in ship salvage.
It all started, I think, when I was on South Marine, and there was a burning ship off the Cape called the Castello de Belvedere, and there was a Spanish VLCC supertanker that eventually broke in half. The bow section had to be towed out 200 miles, and then explosives was put around the bow to release the buoyancy, and then she was let go into the bottom of the ocean. And after that, I decided that that was more my line of career.
Costa Concordia is the longest project he has worked on, but before that, another was even more stressful.
The Tasman Spirit in Pakistan, that was quite a challenge. The ship broke up in the harbour entrance. There was a lot of oil, a lot of political pressure to get it out. So that was sort of 7 months of stress plus time. We had to finish before the monsoon.
Over the years, he's learned that no vessel is too big or difficult to raise from the seas, not even the largest cruise ship wreck of all time.
You get used to planning and seeing ships in this condition, so what other people think is quite dangerous, you've already mitigated those risks before, so you know how to make it safe for people to climb all over a ship that's at an angle like this in the background.
The Titan Micoperi plan involved securing the ship and building an artificial reef to rest her on before righting her in an operation called parbuckling. Although other ships have been parbuckled, such as the battleship Oklahoma after the Pearl Harbor attack, nothing quite this complex has ever been attempted before.
The first phase is the stabilization of the ship, using cables that hold this element, which is lying on its side, resting on its side, and we need to prevent it from doing this.
In April 2012, the first jack-up barges arrived to prospect the subsea surface in preparation for securing the ship with chains attached to anchor blocks installed on the rocks. Carlo Femiani is Micoperi's head salvage master, who explains the first difficulties the team encountered.
Unfortunately, the undersea surface proved to be harder than we anticipated. We had to engineer special chisels, and with these chisels, make holes in the granite, and then use perforating drills to penetrate the rock so as to be able to drill down.
During the summer of 2012, Nick Sloan became increasingly concerned that the island's hard granite might slow the pace of drilling and push back completion of the anchor blocks.
This is a drilling operation here, and it's very shallow. You can see the rocks, so we have to work around the rocks, and they're landscaping the granite. So behind it you'll see the landscaping operation. They cut into the granite to position the anchors. Then the drilling machine comes into the anchors and drills piles 16 meters into the granite.
At last, by October 2012, enough anchor blocks were in place to guarantee the ship would not sink. It was a crucial milestone.
The 16 strand jacks already on the port side. That's just to hold the stabilization wires, so that gives us 1,000 tons per anchor, which is 4,000 tons to hold her in position.
Drilling holes for the platform pylons proved equally difficult.
We had to landscape the rock, put down templates so as to exactly level out the perforating pylons that we will need to position.
As winter approached, the ship was now secured, and the salvage was well underway. The Costa Concordia lay on her side, held back from slipping into the dark, watery abyss by massive chains. Now, the long process of parbuckling could begin. It was one of the most complex salvage operations in maritime history, and would take years.
The ship weighs 45,000 tons, and with the water and with all the structures we're about to build on it, it will reach 60,000 tons. So we have to rotate 60,000 tons from 65 degrees incline to the vertical.
We've had 3 different engineering teams plus ourselves making our own assumptions, and we've come to a range of what the weight is. So we're planning for the worst case scenario and hope for the best.
Passenger ships are characterized by having the superstructures, in other words the upper decks, built with light material so as to keep the center of gravity low, and they have the stronger structures in the lower decks. So the difficulty will be transferring the forces from outside into the ship so as to rotate her.
The idea in itself was very simple. Given the undersea slope, the reef would have to be extended, using a cement bed and steel platforms on which the ship would rest once righted. The Italian company Micoperi specializes in building oil platforms and was confident. although building so many platforms in a row had never been attempted before. Huge ballast tanks, called sponsons, would need to be attached to the ship's side in order for it to be floated. Before it was rotated, they would be attached to the port side only, so their weight and gravity would help pull the ship upright, yet at the same time stop it from rolling over when righted. They would then be attached to the starboard side. Their buoyancy would have to lift Concordia off the rocks.
When we refloat her, we're putting the life jacket around her, or armbands, and we're going to recreate external buoyancy. We're not going to worry about achieving internal buoyancy due to the damage.
The key element in this ship's salvage would be the strand jacks. These are hydraulic pulleys that use small movements to move huge masses. The high number of cables and the small movements multiply the forces the hydraulic pulleys are able to exert.
In total, we'll have 124 strand jacks used on the operation itself, which is, again, quite a few multipliers more than ever used before in salvage.
For the first 6 months, nearly all the work was underwater, and this required the presence on site of over 100 divers. They were lodged in this enormous floating hostel, the Pioneer, where they would eat, rest and sleep between their grueling shifts of work. The Pioneer barge was also where the cement was produced that was pumped into the massive underwater nylon bags, a process called grouting.
We've got hyperbaric doctors on the team. We've got paramedics, 14 medics in total. So we're ready for trauma, we're ready for diving accidents. We'll have 10 chambers, decompression chambers on location. So we're pretty well set up for protecting the diving operation.
Although the divers worked on the anchor blocks and the subsea platforms, they were mainly employed building an enormous cement mattress, an extension of the reef the wreck was caught on.
All the activities, especially the underwater activities, are carried out with no dispersion of material, so it's all done with sealed and closed circuits.
The FEM analysis, that's a model that they've made of the ship. It had 904,000 structural components. It's the biggest model ever made anywhere for finite element analysis.
We have a team of divers who compile a report every day, comparing it with the state of the ship the previous day.
The ship's hull was inspected daily to check for new cracks and fissures. Salvage Masters worried that the constant deterioration of the ship could put the operation at risk.
We have a program that just calculates structural parameters, and every day imports this data, processes it, and it's very nice because the pictures are colored, and we say that as long as there is no red or blue, we are happy.
Biggest risk as we come into winter, we've got to make sure that we protect her as much as possible. So there's a lot of pressure on just to get the holdback anchors in, which will be finished this week, and then well, I guess that's the biggest risk is the winter weather.
In December 2012, as winter storms began pounding the rusting hull of the Costa Concordia, Nick Sloan was presented with a worrying new factor. His engineers said that there was a risk the bow might break off during parbuckling. The team brainstormed and found the only solution was to give the weak bow of the ship extra buoyancy. They designed special blister tanks that fitted the curved hull like gloves, and these were added to the already massive engineering contracts given to shipyards around Italy. On the 13th of January 2013, the families of victims of the Costa Concordia disaster gathered to commemorate that tragic night, together with the islanders. It was the first time in 12 months that the salvage operation stopped for a whole day. By February 2013, The anchor towers on the inshore side of the ship had been completed, and the 22 strand jacks that would pull the ship upright had been installed.
There's 11 towers, each one has 2 of the blue pulling machines. They're hydraulic rams that grab the wire and they put a stroke of about 450 millimeters, and then it goes back to recover the next stroke. So they're going under the water around the anchor bollards, and then they go all the way underneath the Concordia herself. So this gives us about 11,000 tons of pulling capacity.
Meanwhile, Italian shipyards Rossetti, Cimolai and Fincantieri were building the massive undersea platforms and buoyancy tanks in preparation for the parbuckling. Consortium engineers checked that the units were built to millimetric precision. With all the weight of the cruise liner concentrated on the side of the hull and between the rocks she was resting on, it was inevitable that the ship would begin to bend. It became vital that the design and construction of the sponsons perfectly matched their housings on the hull.
Well, we'd like to have more space and bigger tolerances, but unfortunately to get that much buoyancy on the midship section, when we designed it we thought 50 millimeters of tolerance would be enough. That's actually reduced to 38 millimeters, and the worrying thing was that if you had a bad winter and there was any distortion or deflection in the ship's hull, that the actual sponsons would start touching each other with the deflection.
The hard granite undersea surface had required templates to be fitted so as to accurately align the platform pylons. There was no room for error.
We had to make a template that they used for setting the platform legs. We used the same template to put on the seabed for drilling the holes into the seabed. So the margin for error for the angle for the holes to be out was less than 1% of error, otherwise the legs would not fit.
In early 2013, at last the massive steel structures that the salvage team had designed would begin to arrive, and the project entered its critical phase. A year after the tragic wreck of the Costa Concordia, maritime history's biggest salvage operation was in full swing. The first platforms began arriving from shipyards around Italy. One by one, the 6 enormous platforms were lowered. The last, the smallest, went underwater in June. The platforms were welded to the barge to keep them stable during transit, and on the day, once positioned over the undersea template, they had to be detached. The massive shear leg of the Micoperi 30 held the platform in place as it was freed from its support, and slowly the barge was removed. The platforms could be lowered while underwater cameras on ROVs monitored progress. Salvage Masters worried that a single error could jeopardize the whole operation. But the months of careful engineering paid off, as the platforms sank underwater into the precisely located holes drilled to host the pylons.
The 3 platforms on the midship section are just about the size of a football field, and you've got a footprint of over 40 meters between some of the legs.
Over the same period, the massive ballast tanks arrived too, and were hooked onto the side of the ship. The tallest was the equivalent in height to an 11-story apartment block. Again, with millimetric precision, the caisson was slowly positioned over the hull of the ship. It was then slid into the housings on the side of the ship.
The big sponsons are like an 11-story building, just a big steel box, 10.5 meters by 11.5 meter footprint, and then 22 meters high for the short ones and 33 meter high for the tall ones. And they get cladded onto the outside. So on the port side, we'll have 11 for the power buckle, plus the blister tanks. And what they do is that when she rolls over, as gravity starts to pull her over, they enter the water and create buoyancy and slow her down.
Now that the sponsons were fitted, came the critical moment of mounting the bow blister tanks.
Blister tanks are pretty big. They're 36 meters wide, 21 meters high, and 30 meters long. And basically they're shaped like the flare of a bow. So the bow has a very fine flare, and then this is like a cervical collar. So basically it supports the ship around the neck as you roll it.
The massive steel structures were built to fit snugly against the Concordia's bow. But actually placing them on the ship was the most complicated of all the engineering tasks of the whole salvage. The blisters had to be sunk and then gently slipped under the ship's nose. It was a delicate and time-consuming task, but was a necessary step to ensure that the ship would not rip open on the day she was parbuckled. By the end of August 2013, 18 months after the tragic wreck of the Costa Concordia, the parbuckling operation had reached a crucial turning point. Every item of the massive salvage was designed to the most minute tolerances. Even the smallest unpredicted force could cause breakages of hinges and cables that could prove fatal to the operation. The ship's condition was a source of constant concern.
The lever for the breakout force is about 450,000 ton-meters of leverage that we have, and that's quite phenomenal. And it's also a crushing force, so it wants to crush the ship because you're actually pulling the ship together as you rotate it. But the ship, we put in doubler plates on the turn of the bilge, 40 millimeter plates, 5.5 meters long, to try and spread that load all the way around the turn of the bilge and into the keel.
Once the caissons and blister tanks had been mounted, the cables that would turn the ship were attached. They would eventually be connected to the undersea platforms. The massive chains that held the ship back and would help turn her upright threatened to cut into the hull itself on the day of parbuckling. Divers laid specially designed cement bags with grooves so the undersea chains could slide through them.
Basically, when the chains come underneath the ship, we have little hawse pipes where we fabricated to allow the chain to come through. And then next to the chains we have what we call the Kit Kat bags, and that's to support the keel of the ship as she rotates over onto the keel. The chains go into the gaps between the Kit Kats and displace the sand that we put in there, and then the hull is supported on the Kit Kat bags themselves, and that stops the chain from being forced up into the ship and cutting her.
A row of red strand jacks were mounted on the top of the sponsons to provide massive pulling power.
On the top of the sponsons you can see the red strand jacks. There's 36 of them on the outboard side, and they go to the outside of the platforms, and that gives us just on 13,000 tons of pulling capacity from the top of the sponson. So that's like a big lever that just rotates as you pull together, and you got about 24,000 tons of actual pulling force, but several 100,000 meter tons of momentum.
Once the ship had rotated 25 degrees, the sponsons would begin working in favor of the salvers.
Basically, strand jacks do the first 25 degrees of rotation, and then gravity takes over, and then you introduce the buoyancy into the sponsons as they get immersed, and you control the ballasting of that just to make sure everything's in balance. So you want it to be a smooth and steady movement from where she is at the moment all the way up and then onto the platform. And the smoother you can make that, the better the chance of success.
Nick Sloan was now ready for the big day. The islanders were ready too. The equipment to do the job had been engineered and constructed. He was optimistic it would work, although there were still many surprises in store.
We were pre-tension up to about 40% of the expected forces the night before. We'll start just after daylight. So it'll be about 5 hours to get through the critical phase, and then about 3 to 5 hours for coming down and resting on the platform. So 8 to 10 hours, we hope to be finished by sunset.
As the big day approached, Nick Sloan took stock of the massive organization that he led for a year and a half. He was not the only salvage master on the job.
We had four complete separate operations going on, and this is the one team's doing the towers, the whole back systems. Then you got the Pioneer, they're doing the grouts. Then you got the team on the Concordia itself doing all the preparations, the welders. And then the offshore project was the large diameter drilling for the platforms to come in. So they're four completely separate teams and projects. And then you have a Salvage Master running each one of them. So I was just the one that had to take the fall.
You need a strong leadership and to be able to basically bring all the fine and talent that's on board to get them all going in the right direction. A lot of different nationalities, but some really good talent for those nationalities.
Yeah, over 500 at one time, just before the power buckle. But if you look at the rotation, people with their back-to-backs in rotation, so maybe 700 to 800 people have been on site. And that's a big team.
On the morning of September the 16th, 2013, all was ready for the cruise liner to be righted. Over 600 TV and press journalists gathered on the quayside to broadcast the event in real time worldwide. It was the salvage of the century. It was the culminating point of Nick Sloan's successful career. The day before power buckling, storm clouds raised fears that the operation might not go ahead.
Yeah, my wife came over, so she came over for 4 days, and she said, listen, don't waste my time. Yeah, it's a long way to come over, so it's 2 days each way. And we had that storm the night before, with all the electricity and the heavy rain, and we thought maybe we should postpone it for a few days, just to double check everything. But when you're all ready, if you start postponing it, then you'll never do it. So you've got to say, listen, we're ready, let's do it.
In the end, the power buckling was given the green light, after just a few hours' delay.
It's simply that last night the weather wasn't very favorable and we had a few operations that overlapped. But everything is absolutely within the norm. It is as it should be according to a certain sequence of preparation that is absolutely as planned.
As the storm subsided, the command post was pulled in front of the ship. Nick Sloan took his place in his headquarters, located in front of the bow of the giant wreck. He had announced that it would take about 9 hours. The rest of the day would be the adventure of his life.
Yeah, just confirm all personnel of the Concordia.
The strand jacks were set in motion, and as they pulled the cables that were wrapped around the hull of the ship, just 4 centimeters at a time, they began applying 24,000 tons of force. For hours, nothing seemed to happen. "45,000 tons of steel began rotating under the pulling force of the strand jacks. The blue and red hydraulic pulleys only had to apply sufficient force to move the ship a few degrees so that its mass was closer to the center line, where the weight of the sponsons and the ship's steel itself would come into play. During the afternoon, a few centimeters of the sunken part of the swimming pools began to emerge. The ship was indeed moving. Constantly monitored by underwater ROVs, the ship continued to move, centimeter by centimeter. Then, 8 hours into the power buckling process, all activity was stopped. The cables that were slowly being pulled through the strand jacks had become tangled, and a crew was sent aboard to get them straightened out. Extra floating barriers were also laid to control any leaked pollutants. The process was much slower than anyone had imagined. As the sun set over Giglio Island, the media waited and speculated on the outcome of a salvage now into its second year. The critical phase of the Costa Concordia salvage began on the morning of September 16, 2013. It was the culmination of 19 months' work, led by Senior Salvage Master Nick Sloan.
But if you have a rock like this that sticks up like a knuckle, then you have to tear it off. And we don't know the exact forces required for that because we didn't know the profile of the rocks. So then when you started the breakout, when we got to 4,000 tons, 5,000 tons, 6,000 tons, 6,000 tons was getting to the higher side of what we expected. So 6,500 and 6,800. People were very quiet thinking, like, hold on, you know, we're right up at the top side of the curve already. But at 6,800 that she started coming.
The ship had rotated the first 25 degrees and was now turning under its own weight.
At 25 degrees, we knew that we had her. It was just a matter of just slowly putting her down. So what happened was you're pulling from 1/3 of the ship. So you got 1/3 on the bow, 1/3 on the stern that's not been pulled, and that's where you expect it to sag like a banana. But it came up nice and straight, very parallel. We had sensors all the way along, and the maximum deflection we had for the whole operation was 1/4 degree.
The sponsons hit the water and slowed the rotation until, under Nick Sloan's precise orders, the valves were opened and they began to fill slowly with water, providing the soft landing he had anticipated.
It's just the first phase of basically the refloats, the important part to get her away from Giglio. But if we couldn't power buckle, then there's no refloat. Then it became a cut job. So we didn't want to think of that.
By 4 in the morning, the ship was upright, resting on the massive cement and steel structure. Nick Sloan was surprised by the welcome he received back on dry land.
Came into port, by that time it was just after 5, but we didn't expect anyone to still be awake. But there was a lot of people awake. It took a bit longer, but the results were better than we hoped. So that was really nice to see that at 4 o'clock in the morning. Thanks very much. That's enough. So we had a couple of beers, went to bed, and then the next day we had a pig roast, barbecue. That's when we sort of really relaxed.
The next day, the damage to the starboard part of the ship could be examined. The 45,000 tons of the cruise liner had weighed down on the 2 areas that were in contact with the rocks, crushing the balconies and outer cabins. But the steel structure was essentially intact.
At that period, the search and rescue guys, we had to do a survey to see how dangerous it was, steel hanging down before they could get in the water. So it took about 10 days to clean up all the dangers for them. They got in the water and they finished last Friday with the search and rescue side of it. 1 body's confirmed to be identified. We're hoping that the second one is as well, because obviously it'll be a lot better for everyone if we could get some closure on that.
After power buckling, the first task of the salvage team was to make the ship accessible and as safe as possible.
Well, what we've done is on board we've steam cleaned it to get rid of all the muck and taken out all the stuff in the passageways so that we can go through and do a full inspection. At the moment they're spraying the fumigating it because there's some airborne particles which aren't very good for you.
In the meanwhile, the next steps of the salvage operation were being planned. Nick Sloan took a deserved break.
You're on a bit of an adrenaline high for weeks before it happens, and maybe nerves as well. So when you get home, your body collapses, so you just want to relax, sleep. We went up onto the river on the South African-Namibian border. It's no cell phone, no internet, and just canoed and did some rafting, rapids, camping on the side of the river and barbecuing.
Keeping in touch with family while on a salvage far away is one of the greatest challenges of the job.
Well, there's a wonderful thing called Skype. And so, but if you talk to your family at least 10 minutes a day, which I've learned to do, I think it keeps you in touch with them.
In these unique images from the air, the full structure of the wreck can be seen, resting on the cement bags and undersea platforms. Now the sponsons were nearly all underwater. The ship sat snugly on the custom-built steel cradle. Nick Sloan knew this salvage would go down in history.
The biggest grout job in history, the biggest diving project in history, most ROV footage, 33,000 tons of steel. You can build the world's biggest supertanker with that. So if you add all of those together, it's just a crazy project.
It had been a dangerous job, and the salvage workers had risked their lives over the months.
A lot of cuts and bruises, 1 or 2 crushed fingers, compound fractures, broken bones. We had about 20 serious injuries, and then 1 very serious with a fractured skull. But that was treated correctly. I mean, they're all back. So when he fractured his skull, he fell, bounced off a piece of steel, broke his shoulder, arm, and then landed on the deck, shattered his climbing helmet and fractured his skull.
Nick Sloan himself knows from personal experience how important it is to have paramedics on standby.
So there's been some times where I've been hurt without anyone there, and the treatment that you get could be really bad, life-changing. So you want to make sure whoever comes on board goes home in one piece, or at least if they're not in one piece, they will be back to work within 6 months.
Work began immediately to prepare the starboard side of the ship to hold the sponsons that would float the wreck away.
The worst thing now is the weather, winter, to see what other damage is going to happen. But hopefully we've done a whole lot of winterization planning. We're putting large steel girders on the offshore side that will keep it rigid onto the platforms. And then from the bow all the way inshore to the island itself, next week we'll put a tubular brace, and that will hold the bow so she won't be able to move in a yaw, and she won't be able to roll. So she should be fine for winter then.
The November storms were on their way. The Concordia would have to wait another winter before being taken to her final resting place. By April 2014, the caissons for the starboard side of the ship could be installed. The sea on the shore side of the ship was too shallow for the sponsons to be attached at their correct heights, so they would have to be pushed into their housings by a new array of strand jacks once the wreck had been floated away from the platform. Still more strand jacks were installed and their cables attached to huge tugboats to pull the wreck eastwards once it began to float. On the 14th of July 2014, the Costa Concordia was ready to be refloated. Nick Sloan took his place in the control room once more. The sponsons were emptied and filled with air. The ship was raised just 2 meters off the steel platform and tugged off it so as to give the sponsons enough depth to slide into their correct positions. Now chains were tightened around the ship to hold the sponsons tight. Over the next week, as the sponsons were lowered, the ship emerged, 1 deck at a time. At last, decks 3 and 4 on the starboard side surfaced for the first time since the 13th of January 2012. On the morning of the 23rd of July 2014, Nick Sloan said his final goodbyes to the islanders and took command of the largest shipwreck ever salvaged to guide it to its final resting place in Genoa. Tourists and Giglio residents gathered on the quayside to watch the spectacle. The Costa Concordia was headed out of the island paradise. The hydrants of a tugboat saluted the Salvers and Giglio residents. Then the massive floating carcass began to move out to sea, lashed to two powerful tugs and accompanied by a flotilla of vessels. Concordia disappeared over the horizon, a symbol of the power of technology and weakness of the Carnival Corporation's chain of command. This is the wild coast of South Africa, where the Atlantic joins the Indian Ocean. On the 27th of June 2007, the container ship MV Salvaging Agulhas set sail into the high seas, but quickly lost power and crashed against the rocky beach. A salvage company that had famously raised the Russian submarine Kursk from the bottom of the Arctic Sea turned its hand to the second largest challenge in its short history. The Salvaging Agulhas was a 184-metre long and 25-metre wide container ship built in 1995. On the day of the disaster, the ship was carrying 22 crew members and 581 containers of goods from Europe, piled precariously high on the deck. 3-metre swells roiled the choppy seas near the breakwater that flanks each side of the ship channel entrance to the South African port of East London. A short distance out of port, the ship experienced its first engine failure. Winds relentlessly pushed the ship perilously towards the shore and beached and broke the bow. But then the engines began turning and the great steel mass made its way out to sea again, only to experience a new power failure. Prevailing winds soon rammed her against the sand and rocks. With the container ship grounded, there was real risk it could break apart, emptying its 660 tons of heavy fuel oil into the sea and causing an environmental catastrophe, not to mention the loss of precious cargo. A Rotterdam salvage company, Smith Salvage, was called in to quickly debunker the ship and organize for its cargo to be removed. A 550-ton mobile Liebherr crane was brought in from Johannesburg and erected on the breakwater to begin removing the containers. The race was on, as cracks and fractures had begun to leak water into the ship, but not all of it was salvageable.
She's about 184 meters long and about 16,800 tons, and she had a cargo of containers.
On July the 7th, the ship's lights went out. In the next few weeks, the ocean rollers of the wildest South African coast broke its back, and the ship was split in two. The salvage was put out to tender, as the ship was now a wreck and had to be removed. A brand new company from the Netherlands landed the contract.
So, I mean, salvage is, there's a lot of engineering involved in salvage, but salvage is not an engineered job. So we engineer from A to K, and then from L to Z we'll find out on the spot. And you can have a lot of surprises in the second stage of your project.
To be honest, the dangerous part you don't realize because you're working. It's an adventure, so you don't want to see what's happening, so that's what you're doing.
The Agulhas wreck was the second largest in the history of Mammoth Salvage, an offshoot of Mammoth Heavy Lift. The ship was a write-off, as it had broken in two. The insurance companies and owners had come to realize they had lost the ship, and now their only option was to sell it for scrap. The characteristic tower of the Mammoth Heavy Lift Company is where the engineers and salvors who raised the Kursk from the bottom of the Barents Sea planned the next successful project. Here is where the Salvage Master Fokko Ringasma, managing director of Mammoth Salvage, received confirmation that removing the Agulhas from the coastline where two oceans meet had been contracted to the newly founded Mammoth Salvage.
We were bidding against three other fellow salvors, and these salvors all had a solution of bringing this vessel back into the sea, because they come with a marine orientation. We came with a shore-based solution, where instead of bringing the vessel back to sea, we installed the chain pullers and we dragged her onto the beach and then dismantled her, which is much more environmental friendly because all the disposal has been done on shore.
Han Schiet is a marine architect sent down to work out the technicalities and decide what equipment was needed to do the job. The location of the wreck was particularly challenging.
It was close to East London, and East London is a part, let's say, of the Wild Coast, there where there is a lot of current and where, how you call it, difficult weather circumstances meet each other. So it's not an easy part to work with, because you can have very rough seas and a lot of wind, and there is always a lot of current, and that makes it, not an easy area.
Both Han and Fokka have decades of experience as salvage masters. It is a tough life that takes a toll on the men and their families, especially more recently with the liability mariners carry with regard to safety and the environment.
And the bigger exposure for a salvage master in today's world is the non-physical aspects of salvage. For instance, criminalization against seafarers, where we have to be very careful for. You as a responder go out to a casualty and rescue the vessel and save the cargo, but the cargo of the vessel or the casualty is leaking cargo, and you can be held responsible. And there are a number of cases where my colleagues were arrested and put into jail for trying to assist a casualty which was in danger.
Sometimes it's fun when you have nice projects, but sometimes it can be very hard and difficult. It's not always easy. Sometimes you go to countries which are not, let's say, favorite on your list. It's not always easy to work over there, so they're not always happy. Especially my kids, of course, because they don't like that I'm going abroad. But somebody has to make some money, otherwise we don't have the cheese on our bread.
The two colleagues started their careers together in the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War, where tankers were set ablaze by rival oil-producing nations, and the younger salvors were ready to take more risks.
One of the bigger salvage jobs I started with was the Barcelona, which was a tanker hit by the Iraqis, taking cargo on the Iranian side of the Gulf. And we were involved in a large wreck removal of the stern part of that section.
In this amazing film, Fokka and Han are seen during their work for a different salvage company in the Persian Gulf. They were exciting times, says Fokka.
Quite often the crew had abandoned the ship, and you get on board and you find nobody there to tell you what's going on. And I mean, that's quite different in today's world now.
Together, Fokker and Han have experienced the best and worst of salvage, and have seen techniques change over time. The daredevil forays onto burning ships are a thing of the past, at least in their lives. But salvage is a cutthroat business, and the community is small. Often, competing salvors share the same hotels.
When the casualty has a high potential, the operations team is immediately ordered to go out on speculation and don't wait for the confirmation on the contract. But we quite often fly out boxes like these, which are all pre-packed with emergency response equipment, and our team's out on speculation, which quite often meet our fellow salvors at the same location, in the same hotel, and chasing the same owner's representative there.
This time, Mammoth Salvage came up with the solution that was most environmentally friendly, but presented complexities of its own. They arrived in South Africa and made their way to the site, where the situation they found was particularly problematic. The South African coast here is where the Indian and Atlantic Oceans meet, making it one of the most dangerous for shipping in the world. This shoreline is littered with wrecks, including the Smart, a bulk carrier with a load of coal that broke into 3 parts in 2013, when massive waves from each ocean met to multiply their height and terrifying power. Han Schiet and Fokker Ringersma found themselves managing one of the most dramatic shipwrecks of 2006. The Agulhas had broken in 2 on the rocks outside the South African port of East London.
Of course there are always problems, because that's the reason why they call us. It's an easy job, they don't need us. So there were plenty problems. And yes, she was sitting on the breakwater, and that was number 1. And she was broken in 2, so there was hardly any buoyancy left. So the biggest problem was to pull her, let's say, on a small area close to the breakwater.
The team had been able to plan the salvage in their base in Schiedam, near Rotterdam, Netherlands. They drew on Mammoth's wide experience in moving massive objects. One of the world's largest heavy lift companies, Mammoth gained notoriety with the lifting of the Kursk nuclear submarine off the floor of the Barents Sea in the Arctic Circle in November 2001, and has grown since then, moving large objects the world over using an impressive array of tools and even engineering their own. Here in the company's training compound are just some of the massive cranes, strand jacks and self-propelled modular transports, or SPMTs. The Mammoth engineers came up with an engineering solution that was conceptually different from anything the competitors put forward. While other salvage plans had involved pulling the wreck out to sea, the Mammoth plan, says Fokker, was more environmentally friendly.
A previous salvage company tried to get her off the embankment in one piece, but this attempt was unsuccessful. The ship then broke in 2. Basically, the idea was to drag her on the beach and prepare the 2 sections, shorten them, and pull them onto the breakwater where they could be dismantled further.
Now, the equipment was not built on site, the equipment was built in Holland. The idea was scrapping the vessel with 2 cranes, and these cranes were coming from our South African company. And the other part of the project was pulling the vessels upwards on the beach, and that we used 8 chain pullers, and these chain pullers were designed and built in Holland.
The tools to do this mega move job were massive chain pullers. These winches were hydraulically powered with a pulling capacity of 300 tons each. Mammoth is specialized in machines that apply enormous pulling power, like the skid shoes, which work by pushing or pulling a steel skid using hydraulically powered pistons from one blocking position to another, one stroke at a time. Strand jacks work similarly, pulling one segment of cable at a time. The chain puller works in the same way, pulling the chain around a pivot and blocking it until another stroke of the piston is ready to tighten the chain by one more link.
Very simple, they're just two hydraulic cylinders with a clamp which is pulling a chain, one by one, and it's pulling the chain. And yeah, you can create a huge pulling force. It is a very simple machine.
The massive chains had a mechanical resistance of 600 tons.
In our system we're using 3-inch U4 chain. U4 is the strength of the chain, and that's a little bit more than a braking strength of 600 tons, and we're pulling with 300 tons.
The idea was simply to pull the ship up the shore onto land. The difficulty the team would encounter was that the gradient of the rocky beach added resistance to the weight they had calculated. The equipment the Mammoth engineers planned to take to South Africa, apart from the chain pullers, were massive chains and oil-removing machines. 2 self-propelled cranes were provided by Mammoth's South African branch. They were needed to remove the containers that were still in the hold and bulky parts of the ship as it was cut up. All Mammoth equipment can be dismantled and shipped in standard containers to any part of the world. Pre-packed emergency equipment is ready at the airport.
To get your equipment on site is with these boxes, which we have all pre-packed with packing lists, all known with the customs already. They're stored at Schiphol Airport in a custom bond. So it's just a matter of sending this code to the dispatcher, and they can have it in 3-4 hours on a plane en route. The same goes for the teams. Sometimes they go by a liner, but if the connecting flight is too complicated or whatever, we charter a private jet and get our salvage team across.
According to basic calculations, the 3,500-ton bow section of the ship could be pulled up the slope using only 2,400 tons of pulling power, provided by 8 chain pullers providing 300 tons of force each. The plan was to cut the ship up during operations. The other massive difficulty was that the aft section, the heaviest, was also flooded and weighed 1.5 times as much as the fore section, and rested on an old wreck too, which meant that dislodging it and dragging it up onto the beach risked being especially difficult.
But the most nervous thing is, of course, will the aft section float or not? If she's not floating, then she's too far away from the beach. That will take extra time, extra days, then you're losing money. When she's floating, she's going very easily to the beach, then you're very lucky because then you're winning days.
The planners had to take another factor into account. The pulleys had to be fixed to the ground, and even the earth under them could give way under the weight of the ship. The team sought out very special help.
With Mammoth, the creation of pulling force is endless, but you need to have a very strong holdback position which can handle the forces. So we eventually found a company from Botswana. They were involved in diamond mining, and they drilled for us very deep holes with traction anchors and grouting it in the bedrock, some 14-15 meters below the surface.
These are the 8 ground anchors that serve as anchors for the pulling machines, and these are the pullers that are attached to the strong points by wires. These 2 are not being used yet, and these 6 are currently being used to position the front of the ship in order to pull it.
Before the work could begin, however, the ship and the terrain had to be prepared. Debris and superstructures were removed by cranes shipped in from Mammoet's offices in South Africa.
In the case of South Africa, it's very important for a foreign company to have the BEE status, which is the Black Economic Empowerment status, which we have through our office in Johannesburg. That is, in the case of submarine Agulhas, was it very, very helpful.
The cooperation of the local authorities was essential. Mammoet employed the local team to do much of the work, especially cutting up the hulk and removing the remaining cargo. The process of cutting the ship up to lighten the load could be carried out at the same time as the chain pullers were being installed.
We work also simultaneously, not only on the forward section but also on the aft section. So when we were, for example, removing the containers on the forward section, we already were preparing, let's say, things on the aft section. So the project was more or less running simultaneously.
One of the holds contained oil mixed with water that had to be removed to avoid all risk to the environment. They used a special oil removing machine to do the job. Environmental issues are especially delicate today when removing a wreck from a heavily populated area, and ports don't like bad publicity.
As a port, you also hold the selling point. In other words, if you advertise for a port, you don't want to end up with something that is of a vessel sitting on the other side, because they may perceive that as a low point to say there are more accidents in East London, and then they may shift the cargo to another part of the world.
Well, I think when anything like this happens, obviously there is concern. There is concern about oil spillage, about spillage in per se, and it's a very conservation-orientated community. It has been contained, though there has been no spillage. In that sense, we're very lucky. We're also very lucky that it happened on the seaward side of the wall. If it had happened inside the wall, then we would have had major problems, obviously, to shipping movement.
Once the land-based structures were built, the team could begin attaching the chains. The sea and the waves have an unpredictable, destructive effect on the structure of a ship, and inevitably the effect of moving backwards and forwards and twisting on the rocks weakens the ship's hull. Whenever a ship's hull is pulled either laterally or forwards, the stresses and strains on the material itself are one of the unknowns.
You make decisions where to make the strong points and all that kind of things, because that's got to do with the structure of the vessel. But you do that, of course, together, for example, with another team who is to install the chains, because I can say I want the bracket on top and he say we can't reach it. So you make always a decision together with other people what you can do, and then you make a calculation if it's possible.
Han Sheet was the naval architect responsible for attaching the chains to the Agulhas, and studied the ship carefully to identify the best place to locate them.
One chain runs through the bow propeller, one chain has been attached here to the double bottom, and one chain runs through the foot of the crane here, goes round here and out at the front.
6 years later, the Costa Concordia ran aground in Italy, on the rocks of the island of Giglio off the Tuscan coast. And here too, after 2 years in the sea, the resistance of the metal hull was literally a make or break factor in the success of the parbuckling.
There were two different ships. I mean, passenger ships, they are notorious for their light construction. I mean, they only have to be nice for the passengers. I mean, this was a container carrier and a relatively small one. So the strength and integrity of the hull was much higher than with the Costa Concordia. So we didn't have the challenge like they had on the Costa Concordia, where the structure of the hull was causing problems.
By the end of January 2007, the pulling had begun. Hour upon hour of revolutions. The chains slowly tightened under the power of the pulleys.
If you make a mistake and nobody else noticed the mistake, and then you can get in trouble, because that can take, a cable can break and a winch can give way. Now, people can get hurt, and that is sometimes, yeah, that's a risk.
As the 3,500 tons of steel began rising out of the water, the friction against the rocks grew, placing more stress on the chains than the engineers had envisaged.
There are, of course, friction factors, and that's, of course, experience. We did this kind of jobs before, and sometimes you have to pull a vessel from the beach, and then you have always an indication of what the friction factor can be. And also over there we had an idea about the friction factor, and with the friction factor we calculate how much pull we need. And we were also trying to obtain some buoyancy in the vessel, so to make it a little bit lighter, and then we had the idea how far we can get the vessel on the beach.
With all the chain pullers at maximum power, any part of the wreck could collapse under the joint stresses of pulling and the waves.
But at the end of the show, the boulders and the rocks which were laying over there were a little bit bigger. Sometimes she was more a shovel than she was sliding over the rocks. So for that reason we need some more pulling power than we estimated. But that was no problem.
As the wreck was hauled onto the beach, one link in the chains at a time, the workers began cutting more and more steel away, so that once out of the water, and without the advantage of ballast, but with the friction from the rocks holding it back, the frame of the Agulhas was lighter and lighter. But at any time, one of the elements of the whole operation could fail. As the wreck of the submarine Agulhas was dragged up the slope of the rocky breakwater, it pushed stones up in front of it, increasing the friction on the hull and adding yet more weight that needed to be countered by the massive pulleys.
The aft section was some 150-200 meters away, and it was much more heavy. And all the information which we got from the P&I clubs and their consultants was that she was breached and she was flooded and she was sitting on another wreck and it was impossible to move her.
For example, also in this stage was calculating the buoyancy, because you need the center of gravity, the center of buoyancy. Is the buoyancy right? How much buoyancy do we need? Where do we put air? Where do we put water? And that's, I think, was a more difficult job than doing the strength calculations for just making strong points for pulling, because that's, let's be honest, straightforward.
The plan was to reduce the superstructure as much as possible, to reduce the weight the pulleys would have to counter. This was done while the bow segment was being removed, gaining days of work time, since in salvage, every extra day is extra money. As the bow section of the ship was being hauled onto the rocks, the rear was being cut to pieces.
And a lot of people are telling you, of course, the aft section can't float. It's impossible. And when she's floating, then I can assure you, then you're really happy.
In the meanwhile, divers were at work in the engine room, sealing any breaches that would reduce its buoyancy. This was an extremely dangerous job, as the segment was constantly being rocked by the massive Indian Ocean waves.
We spent 3 to 4 weeks of dive work from the inside of the engine room, because the outside you have a big, it's where the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean come together, and the big swells, they are meeting each other. So there's a massive swell and a very hostile and dangerous environment for divers to work from the outside. But we managed from the inside to patch the engine room and to pump her dry, which made her buoyant. And that was a pleasant surprise for us.
No, we created also buoyancy in the vessel. It was not a straightforward pulling power, but for example the aft section was first refloated and was then almost floating to the beach. Only at a certain stage there is no buoyancy anymore, and then it's only straightforward power pulling.
The chains were attached to what was left of the aft section and started pulling.
Initially we had 8 of these machines standing over there. So the total capacity was 2,400, and during the process they were upgraded to 3,200 because we need a little bit more power to get the vessel a little bit more higher on the beach.
There was nothing anyone could do but increase the pulling power of the chain pullers. Now and again, a storm would break, and at times the waves, rather than hindering the work, actually allowed the pulleys to take advantage of the hull's movements.
The weather impact we more or less eliminated by having an onshore operation, where any other method of getting the vessel back into the sea would have a substantial weather delay because of what, like I told you before, the two oceans that come together and the huge swells. I think the weather delay for us was less than 10% when it was really rough weather and the waves were hitting the breakwater and washing some of the equipment off the deck and the breakwater itself.
Day after day and centimetre by centimetre, the bow section of the wreck was pulled out of the water until, at the beginning of February 2007, it lay on the rocks, ready for the breakers to come to reduce it to scrap. Now the most challenging part of the salvage could begin, the aft section. The massive fore section of the Agulhas wreck had successfully been pulled up on the breakwater of East London Port in South Africa, and now the salvers turned their attention to the even heavier aft section. The rectangular profile of the stern proved problematic. An added complication was that it rested on another wreck, and there was no way of knowing how much force would be required to pull it off. One stroke at a time, one link at a time, the chain pullers applied their massive power to dragging the wreck ashore. The rectangular profile of the wreck produced even greater resistance than the bow section, and as buoyancy was lost with the steel hulk being hauled onto dry land, so the machines had to handle even more weight. Here again, the section was constantly being reduced to its bare skeleton to lighten the load.
When we create buoyancy, she starts floating, so we can pull her easily to the beach. Then we scrap the top section off so that she became lighter and lighter, and every time when she's lighter, we can pull her, let's say, 10 or 20 meters higher on the beach. Then we can scrap another part, we pull her higher, then we scrap another part, we pull higher. And at a certain stage, the weight is reduced to such an extent that the pulling machines are strong enough to pull the whole vessel on the beach.
The east coast of South Africa, like all the Indian Ocean, is subject to the occasional cyclone, but the hardy Dutch salvers are used to far worse in the North Sea. Several storms slowed the process of removal of the wreck, but at the end of each, the sun returned and work resumed. At times, the swell of the waves actually aided the salvage rather than hindering it. Other factors were weighing on Fokker and Hans' peace of mind, however. The local authorities were anxious to have the wreck removed and putting pressure on the team. There was also the constant risk of pollution.
Where people are working, there will be pollution. To be honest, of course, we had a fire on board because we were cutting the vessel in smaller pieces, there is oil. But most of the time it was cleaned before it was removed. And otherwise, for example, if it was dirty, then it was cleaned ashore and then it was removed to the scrapyard or whatsoever. We had contaminated containers that were full with oil. Now they went to a cleaning site ashore, they were cleaned over there and then they were either giving back to the owners or scrapped.
Salvage is also a business, and Fokker, as managing director of Mammoth Salvage, had worked out the cost of the operation on the basis of the time it would take. There was a double incentive to do the job fast. Once the bow section of the ship had been cut up, it made space for the aft section, which was also slowly but surely cut up into small parts for scrap. It is also the salvor's responsibility to leave the area clean and the environment safe. The secret of success in pulling the aft section out of the sea was giving it buoyancy despite the breaches and the debris that had accumulated in its hull.
The second part of the project, the back of the ship, is similar to that of the fore section, except that the aft section is much more damaged. Of course, the trick is to create buoyancy.
The Agulhas wreck had been successfully removed from the sea by 8 massive chain-pulling machines, but its rusting carcass still had to be cleaned up. Fokker Ringersma was satisfied.
All in all, we've achieved the goal we intended to achieve.
Both sections were scrapped in situ, were scrapped on site. So also the forward section, which was pulled on the beach, then we cut the top section off and went immediately to the scrapyard because aft of the port, scrapyard was created. And they were cutting all the pieces and separating everything, and then it was going by truck or it was sold. And most of the time we went by truck to a coaster and was then sold to India, Pakistan or whatever.
At the maximum we had 75 people working on it. It was 25 Mammoth personnel, which did the offloading of the containers, the removal of the oil, the installation of the chain pullers and the physical pulling of the wreck onto the breakwater. But like I said, the Botswana subcontractors who did the drilling and the installation of the strong points. We had a diving company engaged in, because we were only a young company, years old, so we didn't have our own diving equipment and we didn't have our own divers yet. So we had a diving company involved in this.
The life of a salvage master involves travel and danger, not only from the elements or the physical working environment. Fokker himself has been arrested in the past, held responsible sometimes for events beyond his control.
Well, it's unpleasant, of course, because you got your home front, and I mean that's the main worry. We operate in areas away from home, and we make our own assessments whether it's safe or not to enter into the country. For instance, we're working now in Iraq, which will put a lot of question marks with your family and nearby relatives. The moment they hear Iraq, or the moment they hear that the husband or the father is being arrested in a country like Pakistan, it's more stressful for the home front than it actually is for ourselves, because we know the backup of our legal team and we know how to get out of this. But it is an unpleasant circumstance that has been added into the business of today, and which was not there 25 years ago when we started Salvage.
As managing director of Mammoth Salvage, in the increasingly competitive world of ship and offshore salvage, it is Fokker's responsibility to get his people in place quickly, either in time to provide immediate assistance or to assess the situation to provide a strong offer to the ship owners and insurers, known in the industry as P&I clubs.
The moment you receive the call, usually it comes in through local port authorities, through local agents or through the ship owner themselves. But mainly the ship owner themselves, they dig into also a legal protection. So the first call usually comes in through a friendly agent or subcontractor in that particular country.
In the salvage business, success often depends on a good level of access to decision makers, and that comes with experience.
So then the first thing is and that's not a Salvage Master's job, but that's the commercial side of the office, establish contact with the owners. Therefore you have brokers, or you sometimes have direct access to an operations manager who's dealing with the case. For oil companies and for offshore companies, you quite often have an emergency response center, and that's what I said. I mean, they put immediately a legal barrier around, so it's not always that easy to get into that. But our guys, they are very smart in getting access to these people, and then they offer our services.
Naval architect Hans Schiet has responsibility for finding adequate technical solutions to every salvage, each different from the last. Mammoth Salvage draws on the decades of experience of its parent company, Mammoth Heavy Lift, and on the daring and unconventional leadership of its managers.
Every job is new. From every job you're learning something. Now you learn something about the friction, now you learn something about the pulling machines, now you learn something about a small container vessel. It's always something that you're learning about. Because, for example, you're walking all day on a vessel. Not all the vessels are the same. So every day you learn something about the vessel, about the machinery or whatever. And that's your experience, what you're winning with in the future.
The salvage of the Agulhas container ship was the first of the newly formed Mammoth Salvage Company, owned at the time by the Van Soimeren brothers, who had made their name raising the Kursk, when Mammoth was a heavy lift company only. Every wreck marks an era in the development of a salvage company, and the Agulhas was the first of many for this young organization. Once more, an unconventional approach was successful in salvaging this ship that bore a distinctive and ominous name.
That I don't know, but there is a huge current running always, and they call it the Agulhas current, the same name as the vessel. And that's a world famous current which is extremely strong.
The life of a ship salver is adventurous, at times dangerous, never tedious. From their earliest days in the Persian Gulf to breaking up a container ship where two huge oceans meet, Fokker Ringersma and Hans Schiet never stopped seeking out their next technical and personal challenge. The Cabo de Hornos, one of the world's finest research vessels, today sails the southern seas. But just before its scheduled launch in February 2010, the ship risked being lost forever when an earthquake triggered a massive tsunami, that threw the 2,000-ton vessel up onto the beach. A year later, the ship was saved by machines like this, the state-of-the-art SPMT transport trailers of a Dutch salvage company whose offices stay open 24 hours a day to respond to emergencies worldwide. The Cabo de Hornos is the pride of Chile's navy. It sails the Pacific, carrying out precious research into the environment of the Antarctic. It was built over 2 years in the Asmar shipyard in Talcahuano in Chile and cost a staggering $62 million. The ship was planned to have a top speed of 14.6 knots, and today is one of the 4 most advanced research vessels in the world. It almost never sailed. The earthquake that struck Chile at 3:30 in the morning on the 27th of February 2010 lasted more than a minute, and at 8.8 on the Richter scale was the 5th most powerful ever recorded. More than 500 people died, and the aftershocks continued for months, devastating the Chilean economy. Although the Cabo de Hornos stood ready for the official launch due hours later, there would be no ceremony that day. The earthquake caused a 2.5-meter high tsunami that devastated the towns of Valparaiso and Talcahuano, throwing boats onto the roads and beaches. The Cabo de Hornos was thrown onto the beach hundreds of meters beyond the dock it was standing on. The devastation was total.
And that beach, it was a black beach. There was old containers there. There was a part of a building washed up on that beach. There were the carcasses of dead sea lions. There was all kinds of debris around the ship. It was one big mess.
So this is one wheel bogie, and we have one bogie line. That's how we land it. So on this line, one bogie line, we can put 48 tons on. And then that means that we have to inflate the tires up to 15 bar air pressure.
And I must say that out of 10 cases, 80%, you go back home immediately, and on the 20%, you're the successful winners.
The salvage company, Mammoet Salvage, is based in Schiedam in the Netherlands and landed the contract to move the Cabo de Hornos back to the sea.
First, a few guys did an inspection, and they made the proposal for a contract, for the plan. Then the contract was awarded to us, and I came there, I think it was November 2010. We came there to execute the plan.
It took 10 months to agree on a salvage solution that would allow the ship to be delicately refloated for future use. Karel van Hoof made his way out to Chile and the port of Talcahuano in November 2010.
The situation was one big mess. The village where the yard was next to, there were cars everywhere on the roads, a lot of buildings were collapsed, there were ships scattered around on the roads, and the yard itself was also a big mess. There were the floating docks, they were everywhere, they were partly sunk, a lot of buildings were collapsed, there were still cars upside down everywhere. The ship was lifted a few days prior to launch, and it ended up on a beach where the yard used to drop their blasting grid.
Mammoet Salvage is an offshoot of the far bigger Mammoet Heavy Lift Company, based here in Schiedam, near Rotterdam, Netherlands. The company's claim to fame was the raising of the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk, which had sunk in the Arctic with a crew of 118 on board in the year 2000. Mammoet, together with another Dutch salvage giant, Smit Salvage, beat the Arctic climate to lift the Kursk submarine from the floor of the Barents Sea. The then owners of Mammoet, Frans and Jan van Zuimeren, persuaded the Russian government that their lifting techniques using strand jacks, a hydraulic compensation system for the waves, and specially designed plugs that opened when pulled could lift the submarine off the seafloor. It was a radically novel solution, suited to lifting the nuclear submarine still loaded with live torpedoes. Smit Salvage, a giant in the salvage business, supplied the massive barge and the cutting wire to remove the nose of the submarine where the torpedo compartment was located. Together, the Dutch salvers braved the winter storms and brought the Kursk back to Murmansk, together with its tragic cargo of submariners. After Kursk, Mammoet made a name for itself by combining heavy lift technologies with ship salvage. It is a cutthroat business, fraught with legal and technical challenges.
So then the first thing is to, and that's not a Salvage Master's job, but that's the commercial side of the office, establish contact with the owners. Therefore you have brokers, or you sometimes have direct access to an operations manager who's dealing with the case.
Mammoet Managing Director Fokke Ringersma is responsible for persuading companies to let Mammoet do the job.
Yeah, the moment you receive the call, usually it comes in through local port authorities, through local agents, or through the ship owner themselves. But mainly the ship owner themselves, they dig into also a legal protection. So the first call usually comes in through a friendly agent or subcontractor in that particular country.
Mammoet Salvage is located in Schiedam, close to the main Mammoet Tower, and here the salvage masters and naval architects that put together the salvage plans store a range of maritime salvage equipment. Managing Director Fokke Ringersma leads a team of marine architects and salvage masters with decades of experience on the most extreme salvages. Not only the Kursk, but the Agulhas in South Africa and the ongoing Baltic Ace recovery in the North Sea. Mammoet's experience with heavy lift gave it the edge over its competitors when bidding for the job in Chile, as the ship was not damaged, just a long way from its natural habitat, the sea. It had been lifted by Mother Nature, and now would have to be lifted by man.
We respect each other, and we know that only one can secure the job. And well, you fight till the bitter end, and after that you shake hands with a successful winner of the contract. You wish him luck, and you offer sometimes your subcontracting services to him, and then you go back home.
The Cabo de Hornos is an advanced oceanographic and fisheries research vessel that is 74 meters long, with a molded breadth of 16.6 meters. It has an operating draft of 5.4 meters, and when fully equipped, weighs over 3,000 tons. At the time of launch, it weighed 2,000 tons and was empty of all equipment. Although the tsunami literally lifted it out of the dock where it was ready for launch and dropped it onto a sandy beach nearby, the structure was still essentially intact. All about it lay devastation.
There were a lot of buildings were torn down in the village. They told me it was 8.8 on the Richter scale, so that's quite heavy, and the damage was destructive. Everything was torn down in the village. The roads were just washed away. There was a big stadium which was just cracked in half. There was a big gap in the middle. The damage was enormous.
The harbour area that Karel van Hoof found when he arrived was covered in the remains of collapsed buildings, and before any work could begin, these had to be cleared. In order to refloat the sophisticated research vessel Cabo de Hornos from the point on the sandy beach where the tsunami had dropped it, several approaches had been discussed during the salvage planning phases. The simplest would have been to use skid shoes to drag the ship down to the water. Skid shoes are hydraulically powered brackets that move forward along a line of rails and hook into one steel sleeper at a time, and then pull forward or push back. Here they are seen in action in another context, during the jumboization of a cruise liner in a shipyard in Palermo, Italy.
The original plan was, because it was a new built vessel, we had to treat her with great care. The original plan was to lift her up, put her on skid tracks and skid her back into the water. But as soon as we came there and reassessed the situation, we found that we better change the plan to put her on SPMTs, which are the modular transporters, and drive her back onto a barge and refloat her in a sheltered dry dock, so we're independent of the weather. And that was the plan we put forward to the yard. We proposed it to them.
The terrain was simply too uneven for the simplest solution, so the Mammoth salvers called in the heavy lift engineers who had an ace up their sleeve. Massive civil engineering work began to prepare the salvage of one of Chile's most costly marine investments. The SPMT is the world's most versatile heavy transport system.
We changed from the system because the skid shoe need a very straight track, and there was too much debris and containers and rocks in the way. And we found that for this particular case, the SPMTs were a better solution. It was also some kind of a gut feeling, more or less.
Well, from this control panel out, we can move one SPMT or up to 500 lines SPMTs. Yeah, we drive now 6 lines SPMTs, and from here out I can drive, steer the whole system and drive the whole system, lift up the whole system and down, up and down, and these are sort of lots of buttons what you do, where you can control the whole system with it. But on the end you're driving, that's only your left and right, forwards and backwards, and your lift system.
The Mammoth engineers are specialized in lifting heavy objects. Here, during preparations for the Mammoth Open Day near Schiedam in the Netherlands, they show off some of the equipment to their fans from all over the world. The main mover in the Mammoth world is the strand jack. This is a hydraulic pulley that moves a steel cable grabber up and down, pulling up dozens of cables by a few centimeters at a time, distributing the load among many cables and many strand jacks. Here in the Mammoth yards, workers are refurbishing and repairing used strand jacks ready for their next mission. Mammoth also owns some of the largest mobile cranes in the world, and this is one of Europe's largest. The new generation platform containerized twin ring crane is a new concept of crane that can be carried around the world in containers that are then used as ballast. Above all, Mammoth owns and operates hundreds of the most versatile transport in the world. The SPMT, the self-propelled modular transporter. Here in Schiedam, Michael Becks is one of Mammoth's most experienced SPMT operators. The SPMT was Mammoth's solution to saving the Cabo de Hornos research ship.
Here you can see which kind of direction you can do in a normal steer, diagonal steer, front, the steering point on the front, on the end, and you can do a circle drive. So that means exactly the middle of the trailer stays in the middle where it is, and then it turns 360 or how many you want to turn around. So you can drive from this point here, I can drive 180 degrees. From here, I can turn it around, or I can drive 90 degrees, full load.
The SPMT is actually an assembly of separate axles, each of which can operate either independently or in unison. The operator enthusiastically shows off the characteristics of an SPMT.
With this in here, there is an hydraulic cylinder, and with this hydraulic cylinder we bring the oil in, or we take the oil out from out of the control power pack, and we can lift up the trailer from 1.2 meters to 1.8 meters. Those 4 bogies are controlled out of these levers. I can do it by hand, always. Always in emergency operation we can do everything by hand, but we do it from out of the control box, and then the computer sends the signals to all valve blocks one by one. We have here 4 steering pistons, and there's a wheel in. It goes in here, connected to the button, and then the steering pistons will change from the direction and takes the wheel also with him. So it's like a slew ring, like a crane. It's the same, but then smaller, size like this.
The Mammoth SPMT can swivel on itself and switch a load around, just as it can move in any direction with the wheels all in parallel. These units can also be attached together to make one massive moving flatbed.
Those are the connecting balls, connecting pin to put a next trailer on it, on the front. And then here we connect all the hoses to give the oil, the next trailer also the oil and the power and the data what we need.
They are capable of rising by 60 centimeters to engage any loads that are suspended above ground, and lower them to be able to move them. A 6-axle line trailer has a 280-ton capacity. The PPU power pack is the control unit and can move many axle lines and control the hydraulics. All the movements are controlled via electro-hydraulic command that ends in the operator's remote control pack.
But you can do maximum 40 axle lines on one PPU, and that depends on the oil to feed up the cylinders. Power pack, this is like this we can do 40 axle lines now. And it doesn't matter where the axle lines are. So when we need more than 40 axle lines, you need another PPU. But we can build it up till 500 axle lines where you want. But then you need a certain amount of PPUs for your hydraulic system. So there's 850 liters hydraulic oil in the PPU.
We started with the project, we started with the design of the track back to the dock, and then we start filling in all the gaps. We had to tear down a building, for example, to make some space, and as soon as we got everything outlined, we start filling in the gaps, deciding what equipment we needed, and then we bring in the equipment. So that took several weeks after the project started, more or less. Some of the SPMTs came from Singapore, other ones came from the States, from Europe. They were brought in from all over the world.
However, getting the 2,000-ton hulk to the port across the uneven terrain of the sandy beach was going to be a major problem, even with the versatile SBMTs. Since the sea was not accessible for skid shoes in the direction of the bow, and the dock was higher than the sand beach where the ship was resting, the salvors decided they would build a ramp to take the SBMTs carrying the ship to a barge floating in the dock.
It wasn't really on its side, it was like on maximum 10 degrees listing, so that's not really considered on its side. But it was actually standing right up there, and it was taken in the execution that we jacked her up, and then we jacked one side up more than the other side, so we got it completely straight up. And then we lifted the rest by the SBMTs because they also have some lifting capacity, and then we drove the whole combination back onto the barge.
The team began working on clearing the area, laying down steel sheeting to smooth the work surface, and building a flat ramp over which the transports could move smoothly, while other contractors began preparing the ship for the lift.
First we draw out the path which was our plan with the SBMTs, because there was also a height difference between where the ship was resting and the dock height. So we measured it very accurately and made the path, because we can maximum be on a 4-degree slope. And that's why we had to tear down one of the buildings as well, because the building was in the path of the SBMTs. So we tore it down, and with huge civil works, we also made a dam around the ship and raised the level there for the sand, so we could otherwise we couldn't reach the 4-degree slope we were planning to make.
Within a few weeks, the civil engineering pieces of work had been done, and the true heavy lift salvage work could begin. The Cabo de Hornos research vessel had not moved a single inch during the time it took for the salvage crews to prepare the terrain to get her back into the sea. The whole area had to be cleared of debris first, levelled and prepared for the massive move. Debris was removed by crane, digger and truck so as to eliminate any obstacle to the ship's smooth movement from its resting place back to the dock.
It wasn't completely finished yet, so for example, the piping in the interior and the engine wasn't completely finished. So prior to the refloat, we had to check all the piping, see if everything was shut off, closed off, all the valves were closed off. The superstructure, for example, wasn't built yet. It was only in the outline of superstructure, but the whole flooring wasn't in, all the staircases weren't in, there was no electricity in the ship. So everything, we had to always carry our torch lights with us. And the ship itself had quite some damage, because before she ended up on the beach, she hit some buildings, and there was a lot of wear and tear on the sides, scratches, dents, etc.
The brackets were solidly welded to the side of the ship's hull, and the bond between them and the steel would have to carry the whole weight of the ship as it was being carried by the mobile platforms. The ship was like an injured patient being carried by the shoulders. Once the brackets were on and the ramp was ready, it was time to bring in the SBMTs.
The original plan was to jack it up, drive the SBMTs underneath and drive the combination back onto the barge. But then we found out that we run into problems with stability, because you have quite a high load which is quite narrow. So we decided to change the system and jack it up not as high as originally anticipated, weld the big triangles to the side and drive the SPMTs underneath. So our combination will be lower and wider, which is of course good for stability.
SPMTs are designed to be able to fit into a maritime container. Here at the Schiedam yards in the Netherlands, they are piled up, ready to be shipped to any salvage operation across the globe. Massive cranes are used to unload and load them to be taken down to the docks at a moment's notice. In fact, the Mammoet personnel are constantly preparing and repairing machinery so that they can be moved to an incident at any time.
So it's a parallel track for getting commercially your contract secured and operationally get your equipment and personnel as soon as possible on site. To get your equipment on site is with these boxes, which we have all pre-packed with packing lists, all known with the customs already. So it's just a matter of sending this code to the dispatcher and they can have it in 3-4 hours on a plane en route.
Actually, we just came there first with a few guys, just to reassess the situation, and then we didn't have any material with us. As soon as we draw the plan and everything got its form, we brought all the SPMTs, the ballast pumps, we brought the jacks to jack her up, all the ramps. That was all brought back to Chile as soon as the plan was finished.
The SPMTs were sent to Chile in containers from all over the world. As they were unloaded one by one, they were put through their paces to make sure they worked. Once the axle lines required were put together with their flat top, they were ready to lift the massive load. It is the most flexible form of transport available to the heavy lift operations.
We used 84 axle lines, so 84 axes with 4 power packs, and I believe we had 16 jacks of 200 tons, something like that. So it was quite a lot of equipment. It was about 32 containers.
When they arrived, they were tested and put to work. The SPMTs were built up with bollards and wooden blocks to reach close to the height of each individual bracket. The fit had to be perfect to make the ride smooth and safe. Then the SPMTs were raised hydraulically until the blocks engaged with the brackets, and then slightly higher still, so that each bracket now bore the load of the ship and rested perfectly on the transports. The ship's keel rose off the sandy beach. The 2,000 tons of the ship rested on the 84 axle lines and their flat tops, which took the weight on their hydraulic suspensions and were ready to roll.
Yeah, we always say, I have to say I'm not really an expert on SPMTs because that's normally outside my work scope, but this was the first time I worked with them, and we used to say, that's what I learned, maximum about 25 tons per axle line, and this ended up around 17 tons per axle line.
While the SPMTs were being positioned, diggers and bulldozers moved the sand from under the ship so as to increase the free space under the keel, and positioned steel plates on the ramp to ensure perfect traction for the SPMT transporters as they moved towards the dock. In order to get the ship onto the ramp, the salvers needed to give enough space under the ship for it to be tilted upwards by 4 degrees. The SPMTs were linked together in 84 axle lines, 42 on either side, nearly 4,000 tons load capacity. Now it was time to begin moving the ship. The 4 diesel power packs provided enough power to drive up the ramp with ease. On the 26th of January 2011, the 84 axle lines moved in unison, under the watchful eyes of the operators.
We drove her up the slope, over the side of the dock, and then we drove her onto the floating barge, which then the whole combination was lowered.
The amazing maneuverability of the SPMTs is demonstrated in the Schiedam yards and was applied in the Chilean port too. Moving the ship up the ramp was relatively straightforward, under the control of a single operator who maneuvered the 84 axle lines and 4 power units. By the time the SPMTs bearing the ship got to the edge of the dock, the real skills of the driver could be shown off.
The barge was, I believe it was a 330-foot barge. It came from the east coast of the state, so we brought it all the way to the Panama gates, to the Panama locks, all the way down to Chile. And the ballast capacity was more than sufficient for a vessel like this. Those barges are typically used for transport of offshore structures, etc., and they're way heavier than this one was.
The ship and SPMT combination reached the edge of the dock the day after the move began. In the meantime, the dry dock was filled with seawater and the gates opened. A massive barge, the Marmac 300, which was 87 meters long, 30.5 meters wide and 6 meters deep, previously used in the offshore industry and able to carry the full weight of the Cabo de Hornos research ship, had been tugged all the way from North America and down the whole coast of the South American continent. On the 27th of January 2011, it was towed into position inside the flooded dry dock of the Talcahuano construction yard and prepared to receive the 2,000 tons of the Cabo de Hornos research vessel. Once in position, the barge was securely moored and pumped dry to give it as much buoyancy as possible to take the weight of the ship.
There's one driver for the SPMTs. He controls the whole combination, and he can either carousel it, rotate it, or he can drive it. He decides where the combination is going.
The next day, the ship was driven over ramps onto the barge, an even more delicate operation for the driver. Any error could tip the ship on its side, and the barge was an unstable surface onto which to drive the units. The barge was pumped constantly to keep it afloat under the weight of the rescued vessel.
The ship was about 2,000 tons weight. It was a casco. She wasn't really fully built, so not all the equipment was there. And for example, the superstructure wasn't finished yet, so it was only the steel casco, and that was about 2,000 tons. 74 meters in length, about almost 16 meters wide.
The margin for error was a matter of centimeters. The ship had not only to be slipped down onto the barge, but also turned through 90 degrees to remain parallel with the dock and in the center of the barge.
But there's guys everywhere with radios telling what to do. You have to imagine it goes very slowly. It's not like a 50 km/h operation. It goes really step by step. So the guys on one side tells him, hey, here you have a meter left, so he knows that and he can adjust his course for that.
The barge fitted perfectly into the dock and the ship on the barge, but the most critical element for floating the ship was the depth of the dock.
We found out that the most critical dimension of the dry dock was the water level, because it had to accommodate the dock blocks, the barge, the cribbing in between the ship and the barge, and the ship free-flowing itself. That was the critical dimension. The width and the length of the dry dock, they were more than sufficient for this.
It took the whole day to position the ship on the barge, swiveling the 2,000-ton vessel through 90 degrees using the unique turning capacity and versatility of the SPMTs. The SPMT driver swiveled the axles. Once perfectly positioned in the center of the barge, the hydraulic suspension of the SPMTs could be lowered, and once again the massive 2,000-ton research ship could rest on its keel. Slowly but surely, without damaging the ship, the supports were removed from the SPMTs, and then, eventually, the transporters themselves were maneuvered one by one around the ship's hull and off the barge onto dry land.
We drove it onto the barge, positioned it in the right spot. There we lowered it back onto the deck of the barge. We took the SPMTs off. We had to cut off the triangles as well. So, because after the refloat we have to moor it alongside the quay. So in the overnight we cut off the triangles.
One by one the 10 brackets, 5 for each side, were removed and the dry dock could be slowly emptied.
We lowered the water level in the dock. The barge was resting on its dock blocks. Then we opened all the manholes and refilled the dock again. So now the vessel was free floating away from the barge. We opened the dock doors, she was stowed out. And then we closed the dock doors, emptied the dock again, lowered the water level, and then we emptied the barge so she came floating up, and there we had them separated.
The complex operations of filling, emptying and refilling the dry dock were complete at last. The submersible barge waited at the bottom of the dock as the Cabo de Hornos began to float. On the 29th of January 2011, the dry dock where the Cabo de Hornos research vessel of the Chilean Navy rested was flooded. The barge that had supported her during the first hours of her return to the sea remained at the bottom of the dock, as slowly but surely the proud steel ship began to float.
The atmosphere was great because there was an atmosphere of, they realized that we came there to help them. And we got all cooperation from the yard. Only the problems we run into was that it was very difficult to get our material because they were literally rebuilding the whole country there. So things like, especially the steel was very difficult to get, the wood was difficult because we needed quite big amounts of everything, and most of the steel was going into bridges, into other civil works. And that took a lot of effort to get that arranged.
The operation in Chile had lasted less than 3 months, from beginning to end.
We did the refloat, we did it more or less in a sheltered area because of the dry dock. So we were quite weather independent, but the weather was lovely. It was comparable to the Dutch or the British weather, more or less. We have had some rain showers, but nothing out of the extraordinary.
The Mammoth teams returned to their dockside base in Schiedam, near Rotterdam.
I think we started, the first assessment team was about 4 or 5 people, and then later on we came around 20.
The moment the tender came out, then you indeed come up with a full throttle team, including your engineers, and then you're going to work out the details.
The Netherlands is home to some of the largest salvage companies in the world, and Mammoth is just one of them. Rotterdam is the center of the Netherlands shipping industry.
Yeah, funny enough, I mean, the Salvage Master has become more like the manager of the project, whereas when I started my career, it was really the hands-on man leading the salvage team.
Mammoth brings together the expertise of heavy lift and salvage, and in 3 major operations, the 2 worlds overlapped to make a rescue happen. The first of the series was salvaging the Kursk submarine, where Mammoth used massive strand jacks to raise the Soviet-era nuclear submarine from the floor of the Barents Sea, alongside giant of salvage, Smith Salvage, which provided the divers and cutting wire. Then in 2007 came the Agulhas, pulled ashore from the breakwater of the South African port of East London. Strandjacks, cranes and SBMTs are the staple of Mammoth as much as of Mammoth Salvage.
I mean, with Mammoth we have in 52 countries in the world we have our own offices, and that's very helpful, of course.
Mammoth enjoys a fan club of over 5,000 people willing to pay to visit the Mammoth Open Day at the training centre near the Schiedam base. Here the biggest mobile crane in Europe is set up near the Strandjack exhibit. It is able to extend the crane arm to 52 meters. And raise a load of 750 metric tons. Working with the world's most adventurous heavy lift company has helped Mammoth put forward innovative solutions for recovering wrecks and operating in the most complex situations. Ships run aground and sink all over the world in the most exotic and difficult situations. And anywhere where pulling power is needed, Mammoth can engineer the machines for each individual job. The ship was now completely outfitted with specialized laboratories and sophisticated marine and mapping equipment. In September 2015, a new earthquake struck Chile, this time 8.3 on the Richter scale and causing a new tsunami. The population and military set about clearing the beaches once again and returning displaced boats to the sea. This time, there was no need for the help of a heavy lift company. The rapid response people are on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, ready to answer any calls for help anywhere in the world. The sun sets over the port of Schiedam and the headquarters of Mammoth and Mammoth Salvage. The sea lane remains busy until well after dark, and as night falls, the lights of the Mammoth Tower go on. From the urban scar of America's most traumatic moment in recent history to the windswept plains of Texas, the story of the United States' most symbolic relic of a bygone era is one of regeneration and rebirth over the centuries. The wooden skeleton has come to be known as the World Trade Center ship. Workers are digging in the mud that was once the Hudson River, now nearly a kilometre away from the waterfront, the site of the most outrageous act of terror in America's history. They are part of a massive urban regeneration project to bring life back to the World Trade Center Plaza. A wooden skeleton appears at the bottom of the pit. The ribbing and woodwork are painstakingly excavated at record speed, as construction cannot be held up in the city that never sleeps. What they find has come to represent the miraculously preserved roots of the world's greatest trading city, New York.
Every morning we went in, we walked by the fire station where all those guys had died. We walked right by their station and then into the site. It's touching, and everybody felt that. I mean, the workmen, the archaeologists, the press who came, everybody knew they were on hallowed ground.
7 years later, the story and the ship has moved far from New York, across the country to Texas. Another scorching day starts over the wooded southern plains. Here, students of the Texas A&M University at College Station work in one of the world's foremost marine archaeology and conservation centers. This is where the single most symbolic ship artifact in the history of the United States is being cured, conserved, and prepared for exhibition. Postgraduate student Meredith Stoops is preparing one of the timbers for scanning to create a scale model of the ship.
Even as you're working and it's a very monotonous routine, you kind of understand how significant the ship can be to others and where it was found. And I don't always keep that in mind, but then it comes back to you and you realize this is an important ship. Even if it was just a Hudson sloop, it's now quite important as to where it was found.
The bedrock of the World Trade Center was this ship that was ultimately preserved by this terrible destruction that happened in 2001.
All these little boats from all along the East Coast, the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, much later on the West Coast, they were the pickup trucks. They were the vehicles that people just used every day to put something here and then take it there.
Donnie Hamilton is the director of the Conservation Research Laboratory, one of the most advanced specialized laboratories in the world, founded more than 40 years ago. Peter Fix, archaeological conservator, manages nautical artifacts that come here. The timbers are at the center to be conserved and prepared for exhibition, and it is here where their deepest secrets will be revealed.
There's less than a third of the ship left, but we have enough historic data and other period ships and some ship plans that we can probably reasonably recreate it using these particular dimensions. Our ship modeler is pretty good at taking minimal remains and coming up with a fairly realistic representation of what it originally looked like.
There are about 400 large pieces and another 200 smaller pieces that had broken off and were just associated. We received just an entire box of their only identification is found outside. So they could be part of the hull. We'll have to see if we can locate and find a home for them in the future.
Early morning, September the 11th, 2001. 2 passenger aircraft crash into the World Trade Center towers, one after the other. A massive fire erupts as the full fuel tanks of the aircraft explode. The heat reaches thousands of degrees centigrade and begins warping the steel columns that hold the buildings up, as firemen rush to the scene and evacuate all those trapped in the lower floors for the next 55 minutes. Then, one by one, floor by floor. First one, then both buildings collapse, folding in on themselves and on top of the people still trapped inside. It is the most horrific terror attack against the United States ever, and brutally ends an era of unequaled peace and prosperity in world history. For the next 9 years, the United States and New York struggle with the impact of the attack. A new tower rises from the ashes. Two great cavities with waterfalls have been created where the Twin Towers once stood, and a single new skyscraper rises in their place, the One World Trade Center. The memorial flag in the adjacent square is permanently at half-mast, but the square is one of the city's tourist attractions. Warren Rees has returned here to see what has become of one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history, one that he helped excavate. Lying under this parking garage, just south of the South Tower, is the place where archaeologists found what has become known as the World Trade Center ship, one of the nation's most extraordinary discoveries, but also one of its least celebrated.
To me, the heavy construction of it, well, so were the towers, you know, but they're gone. Nothing we built is eternal.
During the slow process of repurposing the whole area, the archaeologists of engineering consultant firm AKRF are contracted by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to recover any artifacts of significance. Michael Papalardo, senior archaeologist at AKRF, coordinates the work on the ground.
Well, AKRF's initial involvement stretches back to the years after 9/11, as the City of New York planned the rebuilding process and reconstructing Lower Manhattan. One of the sites was south of the World Trade Center, that it was an area sensitive for the presence of the landfill retaining devices, the timber structures that were used as they built the city out westward into the Hudson River.
As the ancient timbers emerge from the mud, the archaeologists realize that what they have stumbled on is a mystery ship, a time capsule, inexplicably buried for centuries under the layers of New York. The find is potentially laden with significance. Mike Papalardo turns to America's leading ship archaeologist, Warren Rees.
The ship was sitting down about 20-some feet below the street level, and it was in the middle of a large area that was being excavated for the construction. So we were just south of the South Tower, what had been the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And we're looking at the bottom timbers of a ship, a small ship, and we had, it looked like about 50 feet of it at a quick glance. We had 5 minutes to look at it before we had to go to a planning meeting.
The ship, the condition of the wood was simply remarkable. The wood was buried beneath many, many feet of water-saturated silts and clays. And that environment is anaerobic, so there's the normal processes of breaking down organic matter weren't continuing. They had continued for some period of time before the ship was buried. So the portions of the ship that had a higher elevation than the river bottom had rotted away.
So the amazing archaeological adventure begins, with time ticking. The long working days end in the Irish pub nearby, where archaeologists marvel and reflect on the meaning of what they have found.
Day one.
Over 5 days, 2 teams work to extract the ship from the Manhattan mud. A team from New York, under the leadership of Michael Papalardo, and a team from Maine, directed by Warren Rees. After just a few days, they have an idea of what kind of ship it is and the symbolism of where it lay.
We were given a week and told us we could work as many hours as we could in 5 days, basically. And they gave us a week to get ready. So I brought in, besides the AKRF archaeology team, which was great, I brought in some ship specialists, that it was students who'd work with me.
Although the work has to be done quickly, the team nevertheless takes every precaution to record the exact location of every artifact. The ship is a historical puzzle, and every clue is vital to decoding its secrets.
Because it had to happen so fast, everybody makes mistakes, but when you're moving that fast, I just figured we were going to make a lot of mistakes. So in archaeology, you have one shot. It's not like other sciences where you can redo the experiment. You take one layer, you record it, and you destroy it. So you got to do it right. And so normally we record things in about 3 different ways. We draw things, we measure things, we map things. And in addition to that, we used a laser, a 3-dimensional laser, recording every day of it at noontime, and then right after that we had 3-dimensional spherical photography done on the site, so that whatever we missed one way, we'd pick up the other.
Some artifacts are the types of objects that are dumped in as disposing of garbage. There were many businesses in the area, and as the ships would bring goods off of the, would bring goods into the city, they'd be brought off the ship, and some would fall into the open water. So some of the artifacts were simply lying on the river bottom. Other artifacts were perhaps associated with the ship itself. You know, they are artifacts that were being stored in the ship or used by the people that operated the ship. And then other artifacts were in the fill that was used to raise the elevation of this area as the land was filled in.
I thought we had the bow because it was very rounded and the frames were what we call canted. So I thought we had the bow. As we proceeded down, though, it became obvious from some of the construction there, meaning that there was a stern post that came up, and there are things called gudgeons, which are like part of a hinge on the back of the vessel that the pintos from the rudder stick in so the rudder can move. And we started seeing, uh-oh, we've got the stern.
As the ship emerges from the debris and mud, more of its details become apparent. An odd item of wood raises many questions.
Another odd thing about the construction was the stern. Now, the stern is made up of a number of heavy timbers normally. This one, it was one piece, one 600-pound piece of oak that had been carved, beautifully carved, to function as the what we call the stern knee that would be right at the end, and what's called the deadwood underneath, all one piece. Never seen that before.
It's a fabulous piece of wood. It's, I think, 11 feet long, about 2 feet wide, and what remains going up towards the transom is probably remains about 2.5, 3 feet. It weighs 500. We weighed it out. Currently, pre-conservation, it weighs 545 pounds. So it's a hefty piece of timber. So I mean, I don't know if anyone can specifically interpret an exact reason, but it is a wonderful piece of wood.
More yet emerges. There are signs the ship sailed as far as the Caribbean.
The other thing was that it obviously had teredo shipworm all through the outer hull. Okay, that's not uncommon. What was uncommon was that it didn't have an outer sheathing to protect it, as if it wasn't made to go into warm salt water. And when we got the information back from Kevin Eckelbarger, who's with me at the University of Maine, that these were warm water species. And we, okay, so here's a vessel that's flat-bottomed, double-ended, big sloop, and it's going to the Caribbean, maybe Bermuda. It made sense.
The ship's hull is extraordinarily shallow in the water, another clue as to its category.
We got down to the keel, at the very bottom of the vessel, and it was 4 to 6 inches. So here you have a sailing vessel that's 50 to 60 feet long, maybe 20 feet wide, with a keel that couldn't stop that vessel from going sideways in the wind. There are no centerboards. They didn't have centerboards yet at that point. So what was keeping this vessel from going sideways? Maybe a lee board, which would be a board on the side of the vessel that you drop down with, so and then you can pick it up. It's on a hinge. Normally you'd have 2, but some vessels had 1. But we didn't have the upper part of the vessel, so we couldn't tell if this one had lee boards or not.
Lee boards have been used for centuries in flat-bottomed boats, such as this Dutch sloop, seen in the Harlingen to Terschelling race. These boats, too, have rounded sterns. As the timbers are removed and mapped, certain construction characteristics begin to surprise the archaeologists, ones that will later be a source of concern for the conservators.
In the 18th century, almost every vessel, those planks and the outer planks are attached to the rest of the ship with wooden pegs called trunnels. It comes from the word tree nail. And this had 2 or 3 trunnels in the whole vessel. Everything was put together with iron nails. Very, very uncommon. In fact, quite rare. I'd never seen one in person because that was a very expensive way to make a vessel, and those ships had to go through storms. Well, if you have oak and pine and iron and it starts working, the iron's going to start cutting the wood around it.
Most of the ship was iron fastened. I believe I'd have to go look at the records, but I think there are 3 or 4 trunnels that were actually found. But the overwhelming majority of materials were iron. And that's very quick. And it looks, you can interpret some of the labor issues that are going on, the sociological issues that are going on. In fact, if they were doing that, then the product is becoming a lot cheaper than the labor itself.
Once the ship is entirely excavated, nearly 800 artifacts have been collected. Every detail of how they lay in their original position and their spatial relationship with the other pieces around them recorded. The archaeologists and scientists now begin working on the DNA of the ship. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, provides a vital clue. Amazingly, this science of dating the timbers shows that the World Trade Center ship was built from the same white oak woodland that was felled to build Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution was signed.
The FBI and Interpol have software that looks at fingerprints. So if you have someone you think might have done something, you take their fingerprints, and this software goes to everybody's data bank that signed in and compares it. So why don't we do that with dendrochronology, where everybody around the world who signs in makes their data available? We use that same software to do the comparison. And so when they looked at the samples from our vessel, they just put it out, and the software looked and found, oh, someone did that oak tree near Philadelphia, and it's a perfect match for your vessel. It was wonderful.
There were 3 layers of the ship: the inner series of planks, and then the outer layer of planks, and then a series of large structural timbers in between. And they created these small areas where sediments accumulated, and the artifacts in between those, they're called futtocks, between the futtocks were somewhat of a good context archaeologically. It's unlikely that they ended up there from the fill that happened afterwards.
The initial interest in the amazing find wanes as New Yorkers continue to live their busy lives in the financial and trading capital of the world. Little do they know, still today, that deep beneath their vertical city, in the bowels below the subway level, lie other ships. New York has been a trading city since the time of its founding by the Dutch as New Amsterdam in 1625.
I think the English would have probably called a hoy a work vessel. It's a small work vessel from 40 to 60 feet long is a hoy, and it can be a number of shapes. The Dutch would have called something like this, excuse my Dutch, but something like Wildschip, which would be a double-ender sloop about that size, but that was an earlier kind of vessel. I think it's great in a way because we don't know exactly what where it was from, what it was doing.
Back in the day, 100, 150, 200 years ago, everybody had a boat, just about, especially everybody in a seaport town, which is centripetal, not centrifugal. That's why you become so concentrated, because there's no room. Everybody wants to be by the ocean. You grow up on top of yourself. You grow up right by the water. And this ship, the World Trade Center ship, is indicative of that life.
New York was the trading pivot point for the whole of the Hudson River basin. Philadelphia craftsmen built this working boat that sailed down the whole American coast and traded as far inland as Albany. It was based in New York, a city located to take advantage of both access to the sea and major waterways.
So the city was extended outwards hundreds and hundreds of feet over time. It started off on the east side of Manhattan, and they would have to fill in, either fill in land or extend the docks further out into the deeper water. And that was the way the city was able to grow, was through establishing bulkheads and piers and then enclosing them and filling that area in.
Especially right around the Federalist period in the United States, you have an initial boom almost, is just before the Industrial Revolution, but you can look and trace with some research how things are progressing, and there's an awful large need to move product, to move commerce, and the rise of New York. New York was the pinnacle. I mean, it was the epicenter.
Urban regeneration is an ongoing process here. Buildings are put up and ripped down and rebuilt higher still, a process propelled by access to the Hudson River. The Hudson is a shallow, tidal river, treacherous for the inexperienced sailor. Here at Kingston, a group of volunteers are working on the upkeep of a replica of a Hudson River sloop, although of a later epoch.
So this is a sloop. Sloop is a single-masted sailing vessel. This sloop is a replication of sloops that would have sailed on the Hudson in the 18th and 19th century, carrying cargo from New York City to Albany and back up and down the river. So they are a peculiar design. Designed for sailing in the Hudson. Very large mainsail, tall mast to catch as much or as little, rather, wind there is in the river in the summer months. A wide boat, very stable with a shallow draft because the Hudson is muddy and fairly shallow in a lot of places.
The Hudson River sloop Clearwater is the brainchild of songwriter and activist Pete Seeger, as a way of bringing attention to the devastation of the Hudson River by heavy industry in the post-war era.
From New York City and further south, the sloops would have been carrying finished goods mostly up the river to the farms and communities upriver, and then on the way back down they would have been carrying kind of bulk goods, timber or large quantities of whatever to head to the factories in New York City and stuff. That was the general trend of the pattern of movement of goods up and down the river.
The Hudson River sloops played a key role in building New York. Here in one of New Amsterdam's first roads, Bowery Street, stands Manhattan's oldest bank, founded in 1834. And close by is Chinatown, where brick buildings have stood for hundreds of years. They have become one of the characteristics of central New York and represent building techniques that relied on the import of this light, dependable material. And that had to be transported to Manhattan, down the Hudson River.
The sloops would carry tons and tons of brick up and down the river. I often will tell students, like, next time you're in New York City, take a look around. Like, how much brick do you see? You're going to see a lot of brick. And a lot of that brick came from the Hudson Valley and was shipped to New York on sloops.
New York City is constantly rebuilt, over and over again, each skyscraper standing on the rubble of the previous one. A winter sun sets over New York, where the eternal play of glass and steel reflects in the sea and creates a fairy tale skyline of offices where trade never stops. The World Trade Center ship has left New York for conservation in the nation's foremost marine archaeology laboratory. Here in College Station, Texas, Donnie Hamilton and his team have been able to get an intimate picture of the ship found under Ground Zero. Apart from the excitement of having the World Trade Center ship in their hands, the conservators in Texas have the great responsibility of preserving this highly symbolic artifact. They first have to deal with the serious problems that all the nails in the ship pose.
And so we are just now getting to the process. We've gone through all the rinsing. Obviously, in 5 years, all the soluble salts have been rinsed out pretty much. And so now we've been dealing primarily with removing the iron, and that's pretty much has been done now. And then also we've been scanning all the material with the Faro arm, the 3D scanner, so that we can make a complete digital model of the ship.
For about a year, all the timbers will go into a solution of ammonium citrate, which is a chelation, or it'll actually go in and pull out the iron.
Iron doesn't want to be iron, and so it corrodes. And with salt water, we have a further complication, is that it's now the corrosion products are mixed with the sodium chloride from the salt water. And so when you have sodium chloride, you have ferrous chloride and ferric chloride. Once you expose it to the air and the atmospheric moisture, it converts to hydrochloric acid.
We'll start to slowly impregnate polyethylene glycol into the timbers themselves. And once that reaches a certain percentage, we'll then put everything in the freeze dryer for 4 to 6 months, depending on its thickness. And when it comes out, it'll be cleaned and ready to start being reconstructed into the ship itself.
These are all the different vats that have the WTC material in it. They used to be over here being pre-processed, but now they've been measured and scanned, and so we're getting ready to start into the next stage. So we're sequestering all the iron out of it now, and then they'll be taken after they go through the next treatment and put into the freeze dryer. This is the largest archaeological freeze dryer in the Americas by far. It's 8-foot diameter, 40-foot long, and all computer controlled, and essentially it's used for once we get all the iron out of the wood, and then essentially have it pre-treated polyethylene glycol, then it's put into the freeze dryer. Once the water is frozen and you put it in the freeze dryer, then it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state without going through an intervening liquid state. And it's the liquid state that, as it dries, the surface tension of the water pulls all the cell walls together. That's what causes the wood to shrink and collapse, is the surface tension of the water evaporating, pulling the cell walls in. So by going directly to a gas state, we eliminate that problem.
The unit is famed for the 17-year-long conservation of La Belle, a French exploration ship discovered in Matagorda Bay.
when we started the Bell project back in 1995, we thought it was going to be a 5-year project. Well, it turned out to be an 18-year project and at a cost of over $5 million. And so even these, the WTC and the Alexandria, you're talking about more than $500,000 just to do the conservation on these. So the problem is, you know, the cost of doing it, but that's why this lab is a valuable contribution in that we're able to do things here much cheaper than if someone tried to do it on their own and tried to recreate the facilities that we have here.
Meredith Stoops is a volunteer from the Archaeology Postgrad course and has spent months scanning timbers from the World Trade Center ship.
We have to go out to the vats outside and collect individual timbers that we'll bring in to scan. They've been sitting in there for quite a while, so they need cleaned off. The ferro arm is, it collects very minute information, so anything growing on the timber will be picked up easily, so you have to remove anything like that. So after we've cleaned it off, we bring it in, and you'll place one timber down in front of the scanner, scan one side, flip it over and do the next.
Dr. Christopher Dostal has just finished his doctoral thesis on making a scale 3D model of the World Trade Center ship. Using advanced technology, he and volunteers scan the timbers one by one, keeping them wet constantly.
When you're moving this, it has sensors in each of the articulated joints, and if you put too much pressure on one of the sensors, a warning will come up, it'll stop collecting data. And so we were working out in the bay here, and we started to get a lot of error messages from the base of the previous arm that we had. And so we'd had the arm for 9 years, so at this point it was well out of warranty. I'm by no means an engineer, but I thought, well, maybe it's just a loose wire, or maybe it's something, if I take it apart, it's something I'll be able to see if there's a problem. So I brought the arm next door and laid it out on the table, and once I got the final screw out and I pulled the cover off, just a pile of ants fell out.
Scanning the timbers has given the conservators an incredibly accurate picture of how the ship was built.
I'm recreating the ship exactly as it was in the ground. So whatever distortions there might have been, or, you know, if the wood has changed shape over time, or if pieces are broken and fallen into place, that's all going to be perfectly represented in my model. So I'm doing a very good job of recreating what the ship looked like when it was dug up. What Glenn will be doing is taking the shape of the ship is determined by something we call ship lines. So when you're a shipwright, if you're designing a ship, you loft the shape of the ship with a series of lines that project the space through the different dimensions. And so I'm able to use the model this model here to extract the original lines from the ship and then take those, and now we can extrapolate those to get the rest of the ship.
On the campus itself, the team possesses a little celebrated secret asset. It comes in the form of Glenn Grieco, an expert in wooden ships and, especially, building scale models of them. This is the third model of La Belle that he has built.
We start with the remains, and we try to find similar vessels, similar contemporary vessels, and it's just a lot of research, trying to find drafts if they exist, historic documents that mention the construction, or even information about what materials the vessel was going to be carrying. The hull would have to be designed a certain way to carry certain materials. It really differs per vessel, though.
There's two halves to this, right? So whatever's on the table you can't scan. So you scan the top part and as much of the sides as you can, and then you save that, and then you'll scan the next side as much of the sides as you can. And then once you do that, you can go through and find the same point on both scans and tell the computer, hey, like this little divot here is the same on this scan as it is on this scan, and it'll try and align those two. So if you just keep telling it points over and over again, after about 4 or 5, it does a pretty good alignment. And then what the software will do is it actually track the overlap. It'll sample a certain % of the scan and then refine that alignment.
Scanning the timbers has been complex, and getting the scans of each side to match time-consuming. The match has to be perfect, so that the 3D printer can extrude plastic scale replicas of each timber to build a perfect model, giving Peter Fix and his team something to practice rebuilding the ship with. To make the model accurate, Glenn uses not only all the documentation he can get hold of, but also his own experience in ship lines.
There are 3 or 4 other Dutch vessels that have about the same shape. I looked at all of those to see if there were some features in those that we could use for this. Dutch cargo vessels tend to have very, very full hulls. And in the 1830s and 1840s, when you see what the Hudson River sloops evolved into, they're much finer, much sleeker. So we know this is somewhere in the transition. And looking at the lines that Chris Dostal pulled off of the actual remains, you can see it's a much fuller vessel. And so it still has some of those characteristics of the earlier Dutch vessels.
But so the first thing was to put in the spine and to take those 3 pieces and fix them together. And then the next was to add the keel, the stern knee back here, which is this big piece here, right? This would have been the main structural support for the end. And then attached to the stern knee is the stern post. That's a separate piece here. And if I get close, you see that when I scanned the stern knee, it actually still had a bolt in the print as well. The main bolt that fixed the 2 printed perfectly fine. It was scanned perfectly fine. And the hole that it was in scanned fine. So I was able to just use the original fastener to line up the 2.
From the skeleton of the ship, he is able to build a 3D photocopy scale model of the World Trade Center ship, which will allow Glenn Grieco to estimate the ship lines.
First of all, we need to come up with a set of lines for a vessel that approximates the shape. And of course, using all the details that we know from other types of vessels and other vessels from the same period, we'll try to incorporate all those details in and come up with a believable hull that accurately reproduces what the original would have looked like.
So this is basically just melted plastic. And what you do is you put the model in, and then the slicing software analyzes the model and then calculates, it just slices it into a lot of thin layers and calculates the path that a 3D printer head would have to take. Each one of these meshes is added to the slicer software, and then the software goes through and maps the route that piping bag will have to take to build up to this level.
I think what really helps the most is the work that Peter Fix and Chris Dostal did with not only scanning in all the timbers and coming up with a good set of lines, but also the reconstruction, just reassembling them. That always helps.
It very likely was a very broad, flat-shaped bottom with a fairly hard chine. The bilge here, you can see it's a very hard turn. So it would have just been a shallow drafted beamy bus of a boat that could take a lot of people and goods up and down the Hudson River. It almost certainly had a single mast, although we don't have the mast step, but just based on the shape, you couldn't have put more. So there's been a lot of studies of what this ship shape of the Hudson River sloop might be. Regardless of whether or not this matches the previous studies, it was almost certainly a slooped rig boat on the Hudson River.
For many more months, it will be quietly cured and consolidated in the warm rural plains of Texas, where time stands still, before moving back to where it plied its trade, to bear witness to the very origins of New York State, in the freezing northern tip of the United States. On the other side of the United States, far to the north of Manhattan, lies the city of Albany, the capital of New York State. This is where the New York State Museum is housed. Michael Lucas is the curator of historical archaeology.
Well, the first thing is, of course, it's quite rare, and they found the ship, and ships are very interesting for the public, of course, because they're this sort of this little time capsule, a moment sort of in time. And so for me, it was interesting that this particular ship would tie into this larger story of not just New York's role in New York City's role in the development of New York State, but also in the development of the United States during the late 18th and early 19th century. So it's really an interesting way, and the ship sort of becomes a protagonist in this story.
The Dutch didn't have much, you know, in terms of natural resources. They made most of their money by trading with other people and carrying goods on their ships. So they came over here and they looked at Manhattan Island and they said, well, if we have a little settlement at the southern tip of this island, we can control all the trade for this huge hinterland.
Here at the State Museum, we have over 2 million artifacts from Lower Manhattan alone that trace the early European settlements of what was initially New Amsterdam right through the 20th century. So the ship will be a major part of filling a gap in this collection we have to tell the story of how the city grew and how the state grew.
The longtime director of the museum is Mark Scharming, and he has been managing the 9/11 exhibit for a decade. For all New Yorkers, the World Trade Center ship has a special significance.
And so, of course, it's just symbolic that this great tower, this piece of world history, stood over this ship and was never found. I don't know that they knew it was there when they built the towers. They went down to bedrock, but somehow preserved it as well. And then not to be discovered until the towers collapsed and came down. So that story is pretty amazing as well. We would never know about this except for the terrible destruction of the World Trade Center.
New York State was once the gateway to the west and to the north, and the Hudson River was the thoroughfare to the great expanses of North America. The archaeological context of the World Trade Center ship gives us clues to the historical period that it was active in. One of the most startling discoveries was a button of the 52nd Regiment of Foot, a British infantry unit active in the Revolutionary Wars.
In the case of, if this was a ship that was pressed into service during the Revolutionary War, it would have been a troop transport. There was a button that was found that's from the 52nd Regiment of Foot. So it was a Revolutionary War uniform button. Now, does that mean there were soldiers on there from the 52nd? Maybe.
And, you know, and what's New York today? You know, it's the trading capital of America, if not part of the world. And where was this vessel? In the World Trading Center, you know, World Trade Center. So it all fits to the history. It has huge significance to Manhattan and America that it was there. Now, it wasn't meant to be, you know, under the World Trade Center, but there it was. So, you know, looking back from the World Trade Center that's been rebuilt now, here's a piece of that history that developed this island.
The mystery ship was built in Philadelphia and sank in New York around the time of the nation's independence. It offers a mere glimpse of what life was like when the city and the nation were young. As millions of the world's downtrodden came to the windswept Hudson to make new lives, the sloop was buried in the foundations of the World Trade Center. 200 years later, the Twin Towers were attacked and destroyed, taking nearly 3,000 lives with them.
I live in a small rural area of Maine, and so everybody has 5 hats, you know, and one of my hats was I was a volunteer fireman, and 33 years. I was a captain at the time the World Trade Center got hit, and was an EMT for 20 years. And so, you know, we saw those guys going in, they didn't come out. 4 of those guys had been our instructors. You know, so I knew 2 of them a little bit. But it wasn't just that, it was this whole concept of these people going, that's what we do, you know. So I had that personal connection too. So when we went to the site, it wasn't just as an American, but it was also the firefighter EMT in me and the archaeologist all coming together. So I'm not an emotional person, but it is pretty emotional for me.
For 250 years, New York City has grown on the remains of humble ships like this one, built with the same wood as Independence Hall. Today, above the very spot where it was found, the glistening One World Trade Center rises into the sky, a towering symbol of the United States of America's resolve to rebuild and remain the global center of commerce.